forward frames, in this context, what we're talking about, we're referring to frames being forward in the ship. And for the purpose of this conversation, the forward frames or half frames are ones that are notched into the stem and set into the stem, so they don't actually transverse the keel or the stem or the center line of the ship and fasten to it. They don't tie to each other directly with wood. They tie to each other through the stem. So they're both bolted all the way through the stem to each other and tied together, instead of being attached to each other and then that whole frame section, both port and starboard, being bolted to the center line structure of the ship. Like all the other frames, they're all bolted together, connected via the floor section of the frame, and then bolted down to the keel.
My name is Artur and I've been here for 14 months and I'm from Poland. At the front of the boat or ship, you have a slight difference in frames. You don't build square frames which are uniform. You start building, at some point you start building half frames, and then at the very front they are cant frames, and they cannot be connected at the bottom. It cannot be one uniform piece because there is a deadwood, there's the keel zone and stem zone and all the deadwood family in there. They cannot be connected there, so they are just two pieces, port and starboard, and you hoist them separately. Those are half frames.
So every single frame forward that lays into the stem, there is a notch cut into the stem and then a matching angle cut on the heel of the frame so it sits against the stem perfectly, no gaps, just enough room for tar. Lifting these frames up is different than the full frames because these frames are much higher up in the air than the midships frames, and it's only one frame section, so we have to lift them completely up, lift them up higher than they need to be, push it up against the stem, and then lower it down into place, and then make sure its alignment is correct fore and aft against a reference timber that's been put in place that's referenced off the existing hull and the stem.
So harpoons, they are very unique pieces because you don't see them often in boat building or ship building. They are being used only in bigger scale builds, and they are molded pieces of wood, and they're not bent, they are cut into the shape, which is taken from half brass, and in our case it's waterline 7. And they have their specific bevel on as the shape of the hull. So the way I built the hairpins was that I started on the lofting floor. I drew the waterline 7 from half breadth. I drew it on the mylar, then traced this line onto the wood. And also during the lofting, I took the bevels for this place of the boat on waterline 7, and it's the same method basically as the bevels for the frames, but it's just the other axis, it's just other way. And yeah, you basically take 3 water lines across, and that gives you the angle, and yeah, and then you have the degrees. The purpose is the landing reference. So when you install the frame, you know exactly where your frame is supposed to land at waterline 7, in which place. So they give you reference and positioning for the frame, but also the resting point. Yeah, so the frame doesn't hang in the air, because half frames, they are 2 separate pieces, and you need to connect them with a spall, and then when you hoist one, it actually rests on the hairpin, and then you connect it with the second one on the other side.
So those frames have to be moved and rigged in a different type of a system, because we're also having to avoid a lot more of the ship's structure. There's a lot more stuff in the way to move that large frame around, opposed to these midship frames where there's so much space around. There's 2 easy pick points, and you just go to the high points, lift the ends up, and up she goes. Where with the half frames or the cant frames, we're gonna have to move them up and through this tiny slot and this hole, and all the load is gonna be on a point that's up higher in the ship's structure, opposed to, in the case of the midship frames, all the load, once the frame starts going up, the whole weight of the frame is sitting on top of the keel. So you're not lifting as much weight, where in the case of the half frames, they are actually being completely lifted up off of the ground. So it's a little bit more care has to be taken with how we set up and rig and troubleshoot getting this large piece of wood snaked up through all this structure and shoring and cross bracing that we have set up on the bow of the ship.
Well, my name is Pat Woodland from Woodland Boatworks and Timber Frame up in Vancouver Island, British Columbia. There are other components in the frames that aren't as obvious, and in the bow of the ship we have what we call cant frames, where we start turning the frame, the angle of the frames to be square off the hull, and that can't be just taken off the regular three views, so we need to use some geometric development to create patterns, like what we call expanded patterns. So we're trying to cut through the boat at weird angles and then lay these planes flat and make patterns. So that's kind of what we're working through, and in the cant frames.
Now for the cant frames, which are going to be the forwardmost three frames, because the angle from the center line to the stem of the ship is such that it would make cutting it in all the bevels so at such a sharp angle, it makes it challenging to actually make the pieces. It makes more sense to make the sides of the frames perpendicular to the planking opposed to being perpendicular to the center line of the ship. But to loft that shape off of the lofting platform, we would need to establish a new center line of the frame instead of just using the frame station perpendicular to the center line of the ship. So we have to lift off a different shape at a different angle in reference to that center line, because we're installing them and laying them out at a different center line.
Capaz le pilote, ça chauffe de trop. Ça chauffe de trop et puis...